Okay, this video is going to cover what a delegating constructor is. When one constructor calls another constructor in its initialization list, that is, it delegates part of the task of object initialization to another constructor, then that is a delegating constructor, because it delegates some work or some tasks, right, to some other constructor. This helps reduce duplicated code, and at the bottom of the slide you can see an example of the syntax. We have some class name, again the constructor will reflect the name of the class. So I have class name, maybe a few parameters, then you have the initialization list, colon, class name, because this will delegate some work to another constructor. So I have class name and then some parameters and then the body. So this is a delegating constructor because it delegates some part of the initialization of that particular object to some other constructor. In this example, I'll use GameStats again. In the public section, I have two constructors, the default constructor and the overloaded constructor, which accepts two arguments. Then I have these two helper functions again. In the private section, I have two member variables, in this case mLevel and mRoom. Just as a reminder, sometimes you'll have m as a prefix to your member variables in some examples, and that of course makes it easy to see that this is a member variable. So for example, when you do assignments such as here in the setCurrentLevel, we set mLevel equal to the level parameter that we pass in, again postfixing with a p for parameter. So that is where this comes in handy. I talked about this briefly in the structs lesson, so I just want to reiterate this idea. Going back to the constructors, in the default constructor, I have the initialization list. I set the level and the room to 1 by default, and in the body, I simply print this out, default constructor invoked. Then in the overloaded constructor, in the initialization list, I set the level member to whatever argument I pass in, and the room member I initialize to that room parameter. And in the body, I print out overloaded 2args constructor invoked. Simply 2args for short. Of course, this has two formal parameters. Now these two helper functions I'm just going to leave in just for demonstration purposes, and then in main I go and instantiate GameStats twice. I have game, which will use the default constructor, and then game2, which will use the overloaded constructor. I pass it these two integer literals 5 and 3. Then I simply do console output game.getCurrentLevel, game2.getCurrentLevel, and that will again return the level member variable. Okay, so before we move on, I'll just pull and run this. This will print out default constructor invoked, overloaded 2args constructor invoked, so as we would expect, and then 1 and 5. From this right here, and from the initialization in the default constructor, we get the results printed out that we would expect. Moving on from this, I want to show you what a delegating constructor looks like. If you look closely in the initialization list of these constructors, you will see that some of the code is repeated, even though the arguments are not the same. So these are literals, and then these are parameters that we pass in. But to a certain extent, it is repeated code. Okay, what we can do in this case is we can have the default constructor delegate some of the task of object initialization to this overloaded constructor that accepts two arguments. Because with the default constructor, we want to make sure to set our member variables to some initial value. And we only have those two, and the overloaded constructor takes in two arguments. I'll modify the initialization list. I'll do this syntax. As I type, the IntelliSense helps us out here. We can go up and down. We have the default constructor, then we have the overloaded constructor as well, which accepts two arguments, and that is the one that we want to use. This is why in a previous video I mentioned that it's important to name the formal parameters of that overloaded constructor properly. So in this case it's easy to see, okay, the first one is the level parameter, so it's going to initialize the level member variable, and the same idea for the second parameter, in this case room. Okay, so what's going to happen here? Well, in the initialization list it's going to call the overloaded constructor, which is this one right here, and we pass it 1 and 1. So this level p here will be initialized to 1, and then room p will be initialized to 1. Then we set the level member to that formal parameter, which again we pass in 1 for that, and the same thing for the room member. Then we're going to print this out, so we should get this printed out, and then this. If I scroll down, game here uses the default constructor, So I scroll up, the default constructor gets invoked. Program execution will move to the initialization list, which will invoke this constructor. So we initialize those members, we print this out, then we return to this block right here. We print this one out, and we move on to the next thing here, which will use the overloaded constructor. So I'll just build and run this. See we don't get any errors, and that's exactly what happens. So with that first object that we create, again it's going to use the default constructor. That default constructor will invoke the overloaded 2aux constructor, as you can see right here. That 2aux constructor will return. You print out default constructor invoked, which is in the body of the default constructor. Then of course the second object that is constructed will use the overloaded constructor. That is why we get 3 printouts here, and then we simply print 1 and 5 again. If you want, you can go and run through here, run the local Windows debugger again, and then simply step through these lines. So we're at the default constructor now. Step into that line, we move into the initialization list. That is going to invoke the overloaded constructor. You can see program execution moves to over here now. Step into that line, program execution moves to the initialization list. That will initialize those members, the level member and the room member, and step into that. We print out that line. We move to the closing curly bracket. We move back to the default constructor. Remember, we have not finished executing the code in that body. Step into that, so that will print out, and then we return from that constructor, and then we'll go and execute the instantiation of the second GameStats object. Step into that, and we move to the overloaded constructor now, and you can just go and step through. Right, I'll stop that. Again, this default constructor is now referred to as a delegating constructor because it delegates the task of object initialization to another constructor. Another important thing I'd like to note is, in this initialization list that we have now, right, we have this call to another constructor. Now this is pretty much all we can do now. We cannot go and initialize other member variables in this initialization list now. So for example, let's say I go and create another variable in the private section, so an enemies member variable, again in the GameStats class. Now I go back to the default constructor. If you look closely, you'll get a red squiggly here, and the error message here is a delegating constructor cannot have other member initializers. Okay, just a quick demo for you. Again, if you try and build and run this, you'll get an error. A call to a delegating constructor shall be the only member initializer. Of course, what you can do is you can make this overloaded constructor a 3-parameter constructor now, and initialize the enemies member in this list right here instead. And then of course you want to pass in the amount of enemies that you want in this call to the overloaded constructor. It will be something like that. But in this case, I'm just going to remove that. That was just a quick demo for you. You can go and try that as an exercise for yourself. Another quick example, I have this class called entity. It doesn't do anything specific, it's just an example. It has 2 member variables, member variable 1 and 2, and then it has 2 constructors, the default constructor and an overloaded constructor, which can accept 2 arguments. And you should be able to spot the problem here. Let's say we instantiate this entity class. We create some object and it invokes the default constructor right here. We have this initialization list, and it is going to delegate initialization to another overloaded constructor, this one right here. So we pass these 2 literals, and then of course we have the body. So I'm doing the declaration and the definition of these constructors right here. Okay, so this is going to invoke the overloaded constructor. Program execution will then jump to that overloaded constructor. That also has an initialization list. So this is going to call the default constructor, and then that again is going to call the overloaded constructor, and then the overloaded constructor is again going to call the default constructor. So you have this cycle. It's almost like an infinite loop. We talked about loops in the first module. So what's going to happen is you are filling up the stack with those stack frames, and eventually the program will crash. So that is why you don't want to do this. You want to look out for the sort of infinite loop that you get with the constructor calls. And that is going to wrap up this lecture.